London Underground, as Mike said, is the focus of our participation in looking at opportunities, what opportunities there might be for actually linking to our own private high voltage network for bus and in fact other vehicle electrification. Are there opportunities? I'm going to just provide some context and some background. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with transport in London, but this just really provides some of the rationale and the justification and explains why we're so interested in looking at all opportunities to make it potentially easier, more straightforward, perhaps cheaper to electrify surface transport in London. So some of our challenges, I'll explain briefly what our role is in the eLIPTIC project, what our use cases are and what we plan to do. And then just a little bit more about London Underground, the history of the power network, and really imperatives for improving energy efficiency and how some of the solutions to improving energy efficiency in London Underground, or in fact any energy network or electricity distribution network, can have benefits and can complement activity in surface transport. And then just some thoughts about the future of transport electrification, some strategic relevance certainly for the eLIPTIC project, and to put things again in context at the end, what is the scale of the energy challenge as we progressively electrify transport in London over the next few decades. So Transport for London, we're a functional body of the Greater London Authority. We deliver the Mayor's transport strategy and manage the public transport system in London. The scale is significant because there are more than 30 million transport trips taken every weekday across London. And in fact, 80% of those are on the road network. So the road network is incredibly important. I'm sure most people in here will be aware that actually every day the bus network delivers probably 50% more passenger trips than those taken on London Underground. You can see the other sort of statistics. Certainly there is more focus on active travel, and so walking and cycling have certainly seen significant increased investment, and the current 600,000 journeys every weekday in London by bicycle, there are targets to increase that. That represents about 2% today in terms of those total daily transport trips. There's an aim to increase that to about 5% in the next decade. So the challenges in London, and we've talked, and Mike has already talked about air quality as one of the most pressing issues, and some groups have described the current level of air quality in London and the impacts it has on human health as a public health emergency. And we've seen court cases with the government being taken to court and told to do more and to set more ambitious plans for improving air quality and bringing us into compliance with rules for concentrations. So we know that air quality is the key driver, and we also know that road transport is a very significant contributor in terms of the NOx and PM emissions in London. But obviously not forgetting climate change emissions. We've had an existing, or certainly under the previous administration in London, a target of reducing London's sort of collective CO2 by 60% by 2025, and that's based on a 1990 baseline. Sadiq Khan, the new mayor, whilst his team and TfL are developing the new mayor's transport strategy, the mayor has published really his direction of travel and his ambitions for London, and his publication recently, A City for All Londoners, has described an ambition for London to be a zero carbon city by 2050. We need to understand what that really means, but clearly carbon is not going to be forgotten, as well as obviously the more immediate pressing action to improve air quality. I guess the other key challenge, a very significant challenge for London, for all aspects of of life in London, including travel, is growth. And London's population has been growing significantly in the last decade or so. And it's forecast to continue to rise quite significantly from today's population of over 8.6 million to around 9 million by 2020 and perhaps 10 million by 2030. And that population growth, which is about 100,000 a year, is equivalent to two double-deck buses full of passengers arriving and joining London's population every single day. So providing that growth and the expansion in travel is going to be very significant in terms of both public transport, but as I explained earlier, with 80% of all journeys currently taken on London's roads, competition for space is going to become increasingly important, and managing conflicts between more active travel and dedicated infrastructure, for example, for cycling. And we've seen some stakeholders being quite vociferous about dedicated space, cycle superhighways, for example, because it removes some space for cars and vans. Road safety. We need to do more about improving road safety and reducing the unacceptable numbers of casualties, especially cyclists. So there's significant work to perhaps require things in London that we don't, in terms of national or international rules, currently have standards for. So quite significant challenges around air quality, carbon emissions, and accommodating growth in and requirements for travel in London. And that's really reflected in both the previous and certainly now the current mayor's priorities. He wants us to do more to clean the air. And so the existing proposals, the existing plan, because the ultra-low emission zone at the moment will come into force in 2020, but the mayor, as you know, is consulting on doing perhaps more and bringing that date forward. So the proposals include perhaps bringing the date forward by a year and options for expanding the scope of the ultra-low emission zone, which at the moment is the congestion charge zone in central London. So there are consultations that currently any stakeholder can input to give your views on really the impacts of those proposals. But in terms of the mayor's ambition for zero carbon and reducing carbon emissions, what that really means is the transport emissions challenge ultimately will mean less road transport and reducing vehicle use and encouraging use of both public transport where we can increase that capacity, or electric vehicles where road vehicles are needed. And here I'm talking about predominantly private cars, because in outer London, that is where the majority of private car journeys and trips are taken. But those vehicles that continue to have a legitimate use in London, I think there is an agreement that towards zero carbon by 2050 really means all new vehicles sold from around 2040 will need to be zero emission, will need to be electric or electrified vehicles of some description. There are quite a number of ways that TfL is influencing and helping the uptake of ultra-low and zero emission vehicles. So we launched last year an ultra-low emission vehicle delivery plan, which set out a number of concrete actions and measures to incentivize the uptake of low emission vehicles. And just one example, is taxis and private hire vehicles. And I'm sure many of you will know that from 2018, taxi licensing requirements will change, and taxis, black cabs, will have to be zero emission capable. That's not very long in the future, and taxi manufacturers are well advanced in developing and getting zero emission capable vehicles ready to be launched next year. So moving on to our role in eLIPTIC. after that sort of background, that context, the focus is London Underground because we have a private high voltage network. We've sort of got our own version of a distribution network. We're looking at opportunities for bus electrification, but as Hendrik mentioned, Pillar C, which is really everything else that runs on the road, is actually going to be the subject of a demonstration in our project. So what are we actually going to do or are doing? Firstly, it's really just sort of doing some mapping, some overlaying of things like the bus network. So both bus routes, but importantly infrastructure, whether it's bus stations or bus garages, and seeing where those might align, at least geographically, with the London Underground high voltage network. I mean, just in terms of managing sort of expectations, the LU network follows, as you'd expect, the route of London Underground lines, and the total length of those is about 250 miles. If you put all of London's bus routes together, I think you get about 5,000 miles in length. But of course, bus routes, certainly when you look at spatially their origin and destination, there may actually be more opportunity than we might think. So that's certainly an important thing in terms of mapping just the sort of geographical areas where there may be opportunities. A whole host of other issues to consider. There are some legal, some regulatory, some commercial issues, and importantly, analysis of demand patterns and of course the available capacity in the London Underground network. That network is designed to provide energy to run the Underground. And whilst that network is resilient, and generally speaking, track sections are supplied by at least 2 different substations, there is, as you'd expect in the railway industry, a culture where actually the resilience, the need for backup power supply is really at the forefront of how that network is planned. So tapping into the network for other things is not necessarily as straightforward as we think. We have started engagement with LU to understand the evidence needed really and the validation that would be required to actually start to use and to take significant amounts of power from their network. Suitability of bus routes. Colin, I think later will talk about some of our experience of bus routes. By looking at the opportunities for LU network for bus electrification, the question of depot-based charging versus en route charging is quite an interesting one, and I guess over time we'll start to form a view about some of the issues that need to be considered in planning more extensive bus electrification, and what is the opportunity, pardon the pun, for en route charging versus depot-based charging. What are the right sort of combinations? What are the both the financial as well as strategic considerations in planning those sort of charging strategies? And finally, we are planning, as Hendrik said earlier, an actual demonstration. So whilst originally we had thought the demonstration would be on a bus route and for powering electric buses, and we have considered quite a number of locations, bus garages, bus stations, for doing this demonstration, it's actually a question of timing. Timing hasn't quite worked for us in terms of the eLIPTIC project's timeline. So we will be piloting a connection in 2 of our support fleet depots using the energy from the LU network for plug-in vehicles for cars and vans. But actually what we are doing in eLIPTIC is actually validating and understanding the impacts of using the LU network. We had originally assumed actually that LU's engineering standards might mean that there was concern that using plug-in chargers might produce adverse power quality impacts back into LU. But interestingly, because of the very, very high levels of direct current, DC, traction energy, actually the London Underground power network may not be as clean as, for example, connecting into a distribution network operator's network. So these are the sort of things that we need to understand more through the eLIPTIC project. Just moving on, and really a potted history of London Underground and its electricity network. I mean, LU is 153 years old. And in fact, the first 20 or 30 years, the railway was steam powered. Electrification came in about 1890, and over the next 2 or 3 decades, London Underground became predominantly electric traction powered. Today, London Underground every year uses over a terawatt hour or 1 million watt hours of energy. That's a very significant amount. We spend more than £100 million a year on traction energy. And the impact, if we do nothing over the next couple of decades, is that with transmission and distribution charges rising because of the demand profile of London Underground, very peaky demand in the morning and evenings typically, those costs could rise very significantly. So energy efficiency is very, very important for London Underground, and some of the projects like regenerative braking, energy recovery might have synergies and might complement bus and other transport electrification projects. And also, despite the fact that we used to have our own generating capacity, at the moment the only generating capacity for London Underground is emergency backup generation. But actually we do want to source more lower cost, lower carbon energy in the future. So there are plans to upgrade Greenwich Power Station with gas combined heat and power over the next few years. I'm not far off the end now, but just to give some examples of London Underground's existing trials of recuperating regenerative braking energy. At the moment, if the railway is capable, if the rolling stock is equipped to recover regen and put that regen energy back into the DC system, that's generally only usable if there's another train on that same DC track section that is actually drawing energy at the same time. And when that doesn't happen, that energy is lost and goes into big resistors that get hot and heat the tube up even more at the moment. So given the amount of energy used by LU, recovering that energy as much as possible is quite important. So for the last 2 years, there has been a trial of an inverting substation on the Victoria line. And that basically puts energy recovered from trains that are braking back into the London Underground high voltage network. The Cloudsley Road inverting substation, as I say, has been operational probably for 18 months to 2 years. And about 5% additional energy is recovered through that means. And the good thing is that those results have basically validated the simulation that LU did as they were planning where to put in that energy recovery system. Just on that one track section, and there are 9 on the Victoria line alone, about 1 megawatt hour is saved every day. Interestingly, that's the energy consumed by probably 4 or 5 electric buses. So is there actually a role for energy storage that could perhaps play a role in en route charging in the future for buses or other vehicles? And interestingly, LU are planning, this time on the Jubilee line, an energy storage, a battery energy storage system where essentially you sort of take out or you bypass one of the substations in one of the track circuits and you put in a battery. And that's something that's planned in the near future, and obviously we will be monitoring and understanding how that could perhaps, in planning terms, complement other surface transport electrification projects. So the strategic relevance of eLIPTIC, it's important because TfL wants a smart high voltage network as we invest, as we upgrade the London Underground high voltage system for future requirements, more trains, faster trains, air-conditioned trains. But we also look at ways of avoiding the increased costs of energy. That system needs to become smarter. So we're thinking about how we integrate energy storage, dynamic energy management, and potentially link and support other transport electrification. And new value chains, of course, because there is value in perhaps providing grid services back to national grid. Just finally, thoughts around the scale of the challenge. So if there is an ambition for zero carbon by 2050, if all new vehicles by 2040 in London are to be zero emission, what is the scale of energy demand that needs to be delivered to all of those vehicles? This isn't TfL planning, this is my back of a cigarette packet, but in terms of the scale, it gives you an idea. London Underground, over 1 terawatt hour of energy consumed every year. If all of today's buses, so around 9,000 buses, were electric, approximately, no, not far off, 700 to 800 gigawatt hours per year of energy perhaps. And if about a third of the fleet was charging at any one time, that maximum power consumption is probably on a par with what LU draws during the peaks in the morning and the afternoon, of about 250 megawatts. But then actually, when you consider things like taxis and private hire vehicles, when you think of vans, light goods vehicles, and ultimately, I guess potentially the elephant in the room is private cars, again, based on today's fleet, today's private motor cars, about 2.6 million in London, the scale of all that is actually 10 times what London Underground uses. And that's my final thought for the morning.